Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Rainmakers Roundup. I'm your host, Mark Iorio. On Rainmakers, we talk to people all the time about their competitive businesses, what they're doing that's different and unique from everyone else out there in the marketplace. Today, I have the pleasure of having Steve Lubetkin on. Steve is the managing partner, managing director of Lubetkin Media. Steve, welcome. Great to have you on the program.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to be here.
Listen, you have a TV and radio voice. It's great to have a fellow pro on the air with us. Steve,
thanks very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Great to have you. Tell us a little bit about Lubetkin Media. What's the business about, and what are you up to these days?
Mark, we're a audio and video production company focusing primarily on producing audio and video for the internet. We started the business about 16 years ago as a podcast production company. We were actually one of the first professional podcast production companies in the country. And when podcasting first became part of what we now call social media, I decided to use my radio background. I had just finished a 30-year career in corporate PR and corporate communications, and decided to go back to my radio roots, if you will, and begin producing podcasts for corporate and organizational clients. And from podcasting, we moved into video, and from recorded audio and video, we've since moved into a lot of live stream broadcasting. So, we consider ourselves a full-service multimedia production company.
And you're all over the country, right, Steve? Your clients are, as you said, corporate. They're government. You're basically across the board. Whoever needs, outreach, and really the professional side of this is really what you do, right?
That's true. Most of the people who need video today are corporate clients and organizational clients, as you said. And because of the barriers to entry having dropped dramatically since the 1970s, 1980s, when I first started my broadcasting career, my very short broadcasting career, the barriers to entry have become very, very low with the technology advances and the ability to produce audio and video digitally without the need for very large, production equipment. And so we've been working with clients all over the country, all over the world, actually.
Yeah. You have a cool background. I really enjoy talking to you and talking about your background, how you got started in the world of media. Tell us about those early days, where you caught the bug, Steve. It's pretty cool. It's a great story.
Sure. Thanks. I grew up in Monmouth County in central New Jersey.
Yeah.
My dad worked at Fort Monmouth in central Jersey, which at the time was the central training facility for the U.S. Army's Signal Corps. Okay. And they trained military personnel from literally all over the world, not just U.S. Army, but all over the world in all of the communications arts and technologies, from the very basic of climbing telephone poles to string telegraph wire to television production and radio production and microwave antennas and radar and all of that sort of stuff. One of the facilities that they had at the base was a studio where they trained military personnel to work at Armed Forces Radio. Very much like, if you remember, Robin Williams in the movie Good Morning Vietnam, although he didn't actually train at Fort Monmouth. Right. But that kind of concept, to become DJs and newscasters and announcers. And one afternoon, my dad arranged for me to go into the mock-up of the radio studio and learn how to work the control board and queue up records and prepare commercials for airing. And I left the studio that day absolutely bitten by the radio bug. The first thing I did was go home and set up a little pretend radio studio in my parents' basement. So I like to tell people I was podcasting as a teenager, making pretend radio shows in my basement. We just didn't have a way to distribute them back then. There was no internet. The best I could do was replay the tape recording for my best friend while we played chess in the basement. And he was nice enough to indulge me in that. Flash forward a couple of years, I went to what is now Monmouth University, Monmouth College, right. And my first stop on campus, frankly, was the college radio station. They had a small 10-watt FM station on campus, and they said, you can have a radio show if you can pass the FCC license exam. So I studied for it. At the time, you had to pass 3 parts of the radio license exam for commercial radio. And after a second try, I passed all 3. And once I had my license, I was on the air and doing radio shows. That later led to a connection. One of the other people at the station worked for a local newspaper that owned a radio station, and he got me in the door at that radio station to become a production engineer and a newscaster. And I loved doing it. Radio was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Particularly radio news and news gathering. The problem with radio, the economics are such that it's very difficult to make a living just being on the radio. You spend many years traveling around the country to small radio stations, making very little money and having to have 2 or 3 other jobs. And it just didn't seem to be the right lifestyle for me. So I transitioned out of broadcast journalism and print journalism into corporate public relations, and I spent most of my career there.
You tell a really funny story about going into a local retail shop and someone recognized you and said, "Oh, you're the voice of a radio station," and you know it's a pretty funny story. I want you to tell the audience about that.
They didn't actually recognize me. I'm not vain enough to think, and frankly, I've been told more than once, and I use it myself, that I have a face for radio. I went into my local bank to cash my paycheck, and the paycheck had the radio station logo on it. And at the time, the radio station I worked for was WJLK. It's 94.3 The Point now.
Okay.
At the time, the tagline of the radio station was "the radio voice of the Asbury Park Press." And this young woman who was working as a teller looked at me and said, "Are you the radio voice of the Asbury Park Press?" And I kind of laughed and said, "Well, I'm one of them." But it struck me at the time, going back to the economics of it, that I was actually making more money selling radios and televisions at a local department store than I was actually making being on the radio.
Right.
So, it was an irony that was not lost on me.
Yeah, exactly. Where do you find this passion, Steve, for doing what you do? I mean, you're obviously having a lot of fun still doing it. It's enjoyable for clients, especially. Where does that when your feet hit the floor in the morning, where does that passion come from?
Well, it comes from producing high quality content for the clients. When I first got into podcasting, Mark, I was kind of vaguely aware of it, and my wife happened to hear one of the very early features about podcasting on NPR one morning. She said, "You really should be doing this podcasting thing." Because when I left the corporate world, my thought was to set up a corporate PR firm and be a consultant to the CEOs and the chief executive, the C-suite, as they call it.
Yeah.
But that wasn't working out very well because there's an enormous amount of competition in that space from very large firms that can put many, many boots on the ground globally, and I'm just essentially a one-man shop.
Yeah.
So that wasn't working too well, and she said, "You should really look at this podcasting thing." And when I realized that podcasting was sort of like those pretend radio shows, and I started listening to them, I realized that the people who were doing them weren't embracing the professional broadcast quality tools and techniques that I had learned as a broadcaster back in the 70s. And I realized that corporations would embrace this way of delivering their content, whether it's an audio podcast or a video program, but it couldn't look like it was produced by amateurs. And a lot of what I was hearing in the podcasting world and later in the video world seemed amateurish. So I set out to basically relearn all of the skills that I had learned in an analog world when we edited audio by using a razor blade and a grease pencil to cut magnetic recording tape.
Yeah.
I had to relearn that in the digital world and become good at doing digital editing. And a lot of the things that clients started asking for challenged my skills and made me get better.
Yeah.
I had to learn new techniques and just become better at doing it. So I love the idea of being able to produce a finished program for a client that sounds good enough to be on broadcast television or radio.
I want you to expand upon that a little bit, Steve, because you think about all the skills that you've developed over your career, and when you bring Lubetkin Media to a new client, all those years of understanding and the business, you mentioned doing something more professionally. What are you doing, and how do you bring all that skill set to the table? What do you think makes Lubetkin different from, say, other production companies or other media companies out there?
Well, there's an enormous amount of competition. There are a number of companies obviously doing broadcast production, television and radio. What I think we do is we have a business understanding, number one. I spent 30 years in corporate communications positions in large companies in the technology, transportation, and financial services fields. So I have a broad knowledge of how business works. I know from that experience how to deal with corporate executives, how they want to position their commentary and their messaging. So I'm comfortable working with them in a more structured environment than perhaps some people are. I came out of journalism, but I had to learn very quickly that in a corporate communication setting, messaging and content development is done somewhat differently. I remember once early in my podcasting career presenting about podcasting at a conference, and I was presenting with a client in a heavily regulated industry, the insurance industry,
Sure.
who was describing our workflow for podcasting, and she made the comment that before we recorded, we got the lawyers to review the script for the podcast. And some of the people in the audience were really surprised at that. It's second nature to anyone who's ever worked in corporate communications that nothing goes out of the company without the corporate lawyers reviewing it. And
Right.
it was more efficient for this particular company to have the lawyers look at the script before we recorded, because frankly, when you're recording, whether it's audio or video, as you know, if you record something and then have to re-record it, you have to make sure you wear the same clothes, you have to get the people back. It's a lot more complicated to re-record than it is to get the script approved ahead of time.
Absolutely.
That's just one of the things that we've learned. So, from my perspective, we want it to look as good as possible. We wanted to make the client comfortable that we're meeting their internal communications and regulatory needs, and that we're doing it in a way that's effective for them in presenting their message and conveying it through this new channel.
I like to say sometimes, Steve, based on our experience, you and I are roughly the same age, I guess, in terms of, running a business. We're able to see around the bend or around the corner, whereas maybe 30 or 40 years ago, we were not able to do that. So that experience, bringing that experience to the table is certainly, certainly makes you unique in the world of video and podcast recording and video production. We're going to have to take a quick commercial break, Steve. When we come back, we'll talk to you more about, say, really proud moments that you've had in your career with helping people get the word out in terms of their message. We'll be right back after a message from our sponsors. Don't go away.
So, I'm kind of new here, but I've noticed a trend. My human does this funny thing where she goes around and gets all my toys, and then she hides them in that basket by the door. But it's always the same basket, and it's always in the same place. And then she acts so surprised when I find them, but, she's putting them in the same basket. Again. It's like, hello? That's where you put it last time. You were the worst at hide and go seek.
Welcome back to Rainmakers Roundup. I am your host, Mark Iorio. I'm with Steve Lubetkin today. Steve is the managing partner at the Lubetkin Media Company in New Jersey. Great to talk to you, Steve. It's really a pleasure to have a radio professional, video professional, PR professional out there with me today on Rainmakers Roundup. It's an absolute pleasure. Steve, I want to ask you a question about something that maybe say a case study that you could share with us or share with the audience, something that you're really proud of that you've worked with a client on, a couple of stories that you could share where someone came to you and they were sort of meandering, they were not really 100% sure as to what direction that they needed to take, and you were able to guide them and then and watch them through a process that became pretty successful.
Sure. And back in the early days of our podcasting production, we were approached by the Eastern Division of the American Cancer Society, which had recorded a number of interviews with cancer survivors, doctors, and other health professionals involved in diagnosis and treatment of different types of cancer. And they had hours and hours of interviews, and they weren't quite sure what to do with the interviews. And we proposed packaging it into a podcast series of profiles of the cancer survivors and their doctors and their healthcare providers. And that meant weaving the story for them into something that was a manageable piece of audio content. We worked with them on what became, I guess, a 13-chapter podcast series. Wow. Called Survivorship, A Diagnosis to Survivorship. And it was very well received, and we moved on from that. In more recent times, some of our practice has evolved to refocus, ironically, on coverage of news activities and news events. We are working closely with NJ Spotlight News, the public broadcasting news arm in New Jersey. We started working with NJ Spotlight before it was acquired by NJTV, but we're working with them now. And we were producing a number of podcasts and videos of conferences, and we're now producing live streams of their virtual roundtables as the pandemic made it impossible to do live events in person. Yeah. But one of the other projects that I'm really, really proud of, as we got into the news content more and more, we set up a separate division of the company called statebroadcastnews.com, so that we'd have a news brand to go around the news we were producing. And we picked up an assignment to report on New Jersey business news in the commercial real estate sector for a website and print product. And as part of that reporting, we produced a number of stories in audio and video format, like a radio news story, a long-form radio news story with interviews and multiple audio clips from different participants. And we also produced a number of video stories about things that were happening in the commercial real estate marketplace. And those stories were submitted to the Garden State Journalists Association and the New Jersey chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. And I'm happy to say that we've won almost 24 awards for our news reporting in various categories. In some cases, sweeping the awards in the TV broadcast categories, beating out people who work for over-the-air broadcasters. And it's a real nice feeling to have peers in the industry who judge these competitions say that the work that we're producing is as good as the work, if not better than, in some cases, the work of people who are working for broadcast outlets. So we're pretty proud of the progress we've made. We're pretty proud of what we've learned over the years.
That is great. There are two terrific stories, and wow, that is something to be proud of. I mean, the cancer screening podcast series is, it's just such a great way to get the word out about that journey that cancer patients take, and then winning all those awards against with your peers involved is pretty remarkable. Steve, in terms of clients, how do you find? I mean, at this point in your career, you're not out there beating the bushes, I would imagine. How do you find new clients? What's the process for Lubetkin Media to go out there and get a new client? Is it mostly reputation now and word of mouth?
I'm happy to say that's a big part of it now. We get referrals pretty consistently from existing clients who refer us to other people who have similar problems in their businesses or their organizations, and so that's been working for us very well. We do a lot of word of mouth, a lot of networking when it was possible to go out and be with people in real spaces, they call it. We were out at a lot of networking parties and happy hours and giving presentations on panels. I'm a member of a number of professional organizations. I mentioned IABC, the International Association of Business Communicators, the Public Relations Society of America. I'm also a member of the Society of Professional Journalists, the Online News Association. All of these organizations are extremely helpful in reaching people for what we do. That's been a lot more useful to us than traditional forms of media like advertising or anything like that.
Yeah. Good. I think that, you know, as you build your reputation and build the business model, and people start to understand the value that you bring to the table, your reputation starts to grow, and people want to migrate toward, you know, working with companies like yours. I want you to imagine sitting here talking to a young Steve Lubetkin. What advice would you give to a younger person coming into the business, Steve? And then secondly, what sort of missteps have you made over your career that you would have maybe done a little bit differently?
That's two very good questions. I think for the first one, what would I tell the younger Steve Lubetkin? I think I would have probably said, don't be afraid of going out on the broadcasting circuit. I think I was probably, as a young man, I was already involved in getting a family started, and was reluctant to make that move into broadcasting by moving around the country to small market TV or radio stations. Because of the economics. It would have been extremely difficult financially, and I just wasn't seeing that as a path for myself. But I would have learned a lot, I think, a lot more about broadcasting tools and techniques, and I would have been able to adapt those more quickly than the ones that I was able to adapt. With respect to the biggest challenges or mistakes, I guess, being overconfident about business that you think is coming in the door. I had one instance where someone had made commitments to me that they were bringing me a certain amount of business in a certain sector or certain industry space, and we went out and made a contractual arrangement to purchase a very expensive database to do the research necessary for that client before we had a signed contract from the client.
Yeah.
And the client disappeared, literally left the state.
Wow.
And there were a lot of people after him, it turns out.
Wow.
So the message is never buy materials or supplies. You know, the build it and they will come motto is not a good motto for people in any kind of business. You don't buy the capacity, you don't buy the materials until you actually need them. Although I will say this, early on, when we were thinking about getting into video, my wife said to me, what's keeping you up at night about the business? And I said, well, to be honest with you, you know, people are starting to sniff around asking for video, and I don't have the gear yet. And I'm really afraid somebody's going to call me and say, we need you to shoot video now, get in here in 2 hours, and I'm going to be scrambling. So she said, well, why don't you just go price some equipment and start buying the equipment? You know, it was a big investment, and I didn't have anybody at the time who wanted video.
Right.
But I did happen to have a good friend who had believe it or not, a wedding and bar mitzvah video business that he ran on the side as his side hustle.
Okay.
And he was retiring from that. I called him up. I said, what are you doing with your equipment? He said, well, I'm thinking of selling it. And I said, I'll be over tonight. And I bought the equipment from him. Most of it was very old, and you know, he had a lot of, you know, old traditional TV lights that had batteries that ran out in about 10 minutes and were very hot while they were on.
Sure.
That were useless to me. But I got two very good cameras, And I've crossed my fingers hoping that the business would come because I built it.
Yeah.
And within a couple of weeks, we got our first video job that paid for the investment in the gear. And so that kind of launched us. And from that point on, we buy the equipment as we need it. We make the investments as we see the businesses there. So,
Yeah.
Build it and they will come, not so much.
Unless you're in baseball, right? Or Field of Dreams or something.
I don't know how that baseball field is doing out there in Iowa.
They were supposed to have a major league game out there last year, but it didn't work. It's been an absolute pleasure having you, Steve. That's great story, great advice. Thanks for sharing that. Where do you find inspiration? Where does that come from?
Just from doing great work, learning new techniques, learning how to do things that are going to make the clients really happy. And, when they say, can you do X, Y, Z? I always try to answer, of course, and then if I need to get tools or training to do it, we get it done.
Yeah. Yeah, and those, as you told me in the past, those, iconic broadcasters out there that sort of pave the way for people like you is another way of feeling inspiration.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I as a young man, I was inspired very much by the work of certainly Woodward and Bernstein as I was a print reporter, but also Dan Rather and his ability to stand up to a previous president who needed standing up to. People like that, and reading about their careers and the challenges that they faced, it inspired me to see what I could do and where I could take this.
Steve, it's been a pleasure, my friend. I appreciate the time today. Tell everyone how to get in touch with Lubetkin Media, please.
Oh, sure. You can certainly go to the website. The easiest way to remember it is beingthemedia.com. Just beingthemedia.com. That's our main website. We also have statebroadcastnews.com. And I would like to slip in a plug from the book that I co-authored with Toronto podcaster Donna Papacosta. It's called The Business of Podcasting, How to Take Your Podcasting Passion from the Personal to the Professional. And that book has a website. It's thebusinessofpodcasting.com.
Awesome. All right, Steve, have a great time, great week. Thank you so much for joining. We'll see you next time right here on Rainmakers Roundup, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us. Have a wonderful week. See you soon.